Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of the Rational Stand podcast. I'm your host, Nicholas Woode-Smith, and I'm joined by Ayanda Zulu, Joe Emilio, and Sean McLaughlin. This week, we've got two topics, one much revisited, but still incredibly important, and another which is we're really excited to talk about because it's a big and potentially prosperous or potentially very disappointing. The first topic is something we've discussed on the podcast already, but really needs repeating, and especially pertinent as the Free Market Foundation has released another paper on the tobacco bill. But this time, instead of focusing on the violations of consumer rights and the lunacy of the bill in general, the focus is on its constitutional implications and its ministerial overreach. For those who don't know, just to quickly summarize the tobacco bill, it wants to impose restrictions on where people can smoke, product advertising, product placement. There's a whole mess of problems with it. I advise you guys to go to the Free Market Foundation website or just to Google the tobacco bill and you'll find out what it's about. And it's terrifying, even if you're not a smoker. But the part that really terrifies me is that there are clauses in the bill where the Minister of Health and a committee that he or she appoints, not elected, appoints, are able to create new regulations at will. So in the bill, they have like a list of spaces we're not allowed to smoke. And at the end, they say the minister or the monitoring committee can declare at their discretion new locations that you're not allowed to smoke. They're also allowed to introduce new regulations across the spectrum. And this is a problem because there has to be a separation between the executive, which implements the law, which governs the state, and the legislature, which represents the will of the people and passes laws and passes regulations through a transparent system that involves public participation and adhering to the rule of law. So this is a very terrifying possibility. Let's start with Ayanda. So what can you tell us? Are you also as scared as I am about our new health minister who's going to become an emperor of this country?
Thank you very much for that introduction, Nicholas. I'm not a smoker myself. I must add that. But I do think, as you've said, that I'm very concerned about how this proposed bill undermines that trias politica, the separation of powers that you speak of. Because as you've clearly noted, lawmaking is a function of the legislature. It's parliament that passes laws, that makes laws, and that process, as you've said, involves public participation. At some point, the public is allowed to make submissions, to object, or to accept whatever provisions are being put forward before the country. So when you have a situation where lawmaking is now being made by the executive, you have the executive now making laws, you have a minister being given the power to introduce regulations that prohibit smoking in any area that he deems inappropriate. Maybe it poses a health hazard or he wants to reduce exposure. He now has the power to do that. So it is a very dangerous piece of legislation in that sense. And it sets a very dangerous precedent as well, because it means in future, if the ANC wants to pass laws, but it knows it has lost its majority in parliament, it can simply use this approach of allowing its own ministers the power to introduce regulations that are effectively laws, because being able to say people aren't allowed to smoke in a particular area, that is you having the power to create an offense and to make a law. So it is a very dangerous precedent that concentrates power in the executive. The executive isn't responsible for making laws, as I've said. It is simply there to implement them. To my next point regarding the tobacco bill, which I want to also make, and this has to do with some of the restrictions that it introduces. I mean, the first one being the equation of tobacco products with e-vaping products and other things. That on its own is problematic, because what the research shows is that these e-vaping products actually play a role in reducing the consumption of tobacco. They encourage people to actually stop smoking. So when you're going to equate those two products and then introduce restrictions on them as well, where you standardize packaging, where you prohibit advertising, and more dangerously, you also prohibit displaying them. So when you walk into a shop, you can't see these products anymore. That has a negative impact, and it actually drives consumers to the illicit market, which is the very thing you don't want as government. Government wants to generate revenue from tobacco products. But when you do that and you drive consumers to illicit markets, you're losing billions and billions of rands in tax revenue. So it is shooting yourself in the foot. My last point regarding this: um, if you want to reduce consumption of tobacco in this country, there are other ways of doing this without waging a war against business. Because if you're saying that even even packaging must be standardized, what does that mean about brands and brand differentiation? Because there are certain brands that each and every company has that it sells to its customers. So if you're going to standardize packaging, you are in fact interfering with the work that business does as well. So really, there are other ways of going about it that don't involve waging a war on business, that don't involve blurring the lines between the executive and the legislature, and that also don't involve you waging a war on business. As it stands in this country, the illicit tobacco market accounts for roughly 60% of tobacco trade in this country. 60% of tobacco trade in this country. So already the real tobacco lords, as I once noted, are not the legal owners. These are people who are in the illicit market. And many of them, in fact, are politicians. We saw this again back 5 years ago when they implemented lockdowns. They said these lockdowns would lead to a reduction in the consumption of tobacco. They did not. Only around 7.5% people quit, meaning 93% or 92% of people did not quit. And after the lockdown, of those 7.5% people, more than 60% of them relapsed. So the bans again were ineffective in reducing consumption. So my point again here is that we must be wary of these pieces of legislation that politicians want to pass to really advance their own interests as well.
Thank you. I just want to bring up the screen over here just to point out how a lot of the politicians are in bed with these cartels. That due to the COVID, when the cigarettes sales were banned during COVID, the cartels made so much money, they actually had to start laundering it. They had to create an entire industry that really enriched a hang of a lot of politicians and a hang of a lot of criminals. And there's still a lot of evidence that kind of shows that I don't want to get into libel territory, but there were people who were a part of the policymakers during lockdown, who were part of banning cigarettes, who made a hang of a lot of money while that was happening. Also, before we move on to you, Joe, another thing I wanted to mention is that Sweden almost had standardized packaging for cigarettes, where they wanted to have plain packaging. They wanted to get rid of this brand differentiation, and they blocked it because it violated the constitutional right to expression. It was they said it violated free speech, and that's I think that's definitely something to say, that we have a right to express ourselves even if it's commercial. And I think that Joe, you could probably expand on that if you want, or whatever point you want to make. I'm not going to put words in your mouth.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks once again for having me, guys. It's great to be here. Sean, nice to meet you. Ayanda also. And look, I gotta agree with Ayanda. Like everything he says, pretty much anything I would say. I think it's, but I think there's a broader picture to be made here as well. Is like this constant effort from the ANC government specifically to control industries and what people do and how much people can do of what. I mean, the tobacco bill is a problem. Recently, there was amendments to the baby safe boxes. I don't know if you guys heard about that. That basically the government wants to make that illegal, yet it saved countless babies. But now the government wants to step in on that. Government wants to regulate almost everything. If it breathes, regulate it. And it just shows you how little the government actually cares, or specifically the ANC government actually cares about the everyday person that walks their lives or tries to make a living in South Africa. And I think, I know I keep pointing out the ANC, but people will say, oh, but we're in a GNU now. Well, that makes it even worse for me, right? Like the DA was like this whole thing about like, we're going to save South Africa, we're going to prevent this, we're going to prevent that. They've done almost nothing. Yeah, they're in legal battles and so on, and they're probably fighting this tobacco bill as well. But it seems that the ANC just still, till this day, keeps on getting away with more regulation, more things that harm people, more things that actually make it ridiculous to live in South Africa. I think this attack on smokers, I used to be a smoker, I'm not a smoker anymore, but I do believe in the right for people to choose what they want to smoke. I think they're hurting the businesses, they're hurting the industry, they're hurting the private sector of smoking and tobacco industry. And like Ayanda said, like just helping the illegal side of things just grow, because again, brilliant example of lockdown. Smokers are still going to smoke. Like they're going to find a way, even if they have to pay. I mean, my neighbor at one point was paying 250 Rand for a crappy box of cigarettes. Like they tasted awful, absolutely awful. I'm sure they knocked off 20 years off his life. But and the funny thing is that after lockdown, what I've noticed with some of my smoking friends is they're still buying the cheaper option. They're still buying those illicit cigarettes. So even after lockdown, and maybe that's the whole point of regulating the private sector of tobacco, is that the illicit ones are still out there in circulation, more so probably than ever before, because they got people hooked, not because it tastes good, but because it's far cheaper than the Marlboros that are out there, and the Stuyvesants and all those, which are crazy expensive. I look at sometimes the prices and I'm like, I'm so happy I don't smoke. If I was still smoking, I think the price would be a reason to stop, because the budget for smoking is very high. Even with vaping, they want to control vaping too, and tax the hell out of that. And vaping is supposed to be a healthier option. Jury's still out on that, but regardless, vaping is actually what helped me stop smoking. So I don't on this topic, it's just very, very annoying, frustrating to have a government that just willy-nilly thinks they can do whatever they want to do. And they've had an attack on tobacco for the longest time. And I think also it's up to the private sector, the tobacco industry, businesses and all that, to also grow a bit of a backbone and stand up against the government a little bit. And because it feels like these companies don't really do much to, fight against the situation. They just kind of bend over backwards, or they go like, let's just go with the law because we're supposed to, or whatever. Or let's just go with these policies because, it's law now. I think there's other ways that businesses can maybe, treat government, speak to government and say like, hey, this is hurting us. And why are you promoting illicit cigarettes, which is harming people? Because the crap that's put in, you think cigarettes are bad. Wait until you hear what comes out about the illicit guys, because that's horrible stuff. And it's like we don't learn, because like just the other day, remember the whole thing in the townships with the kids that were dying because of the food there, because they were taking shortcuts, and kids were dying. The same thing is going to happen with the cigarettes in the illicit trade, right? The cuck that is put in there is very harmful to human beings, and it's going to make the situation far worse. So that's my opinion on that.
Very good points there. Just to add something from my side with the tobacco industry, I agree with you that business in general in South Africa needs to put more effort into actually opposing bad policies that hurt them. I do know, because I followed the public participation side of it, and that was what my paper was about, was following the opposition to the bill and if the government's actually taking that into account. And something which is a little bit, I do feel bad for the tobacco industry. It's weird. People think, oh, no, I feel bad for the tobacco industry, the big evil guys. So a big thing behind the tobacco bill is this thing called the FCCTC. It's the World Health Organization's framework for the tobacco control. It stands something else, but don't quote me on that exact abbreviation. Now it's been too long since I read that long word. But a part of it is literally saying that when you're passing anti-tobacco legislation, you have to actively exclude the tobacco industry. And that was one of the big problems with the participation, is you're taking this huge industry that are tax-paying citizens, and you're saying, well, we don't like you. We've decided arbitrarily we don't like you, so you don't get any say. And that was also a big problem for the constitutional implications, that they were just ignoring a huge subset of the population because they just decided they don't like them. Sean, you're from a civilized country with, and I especially want your view on the fact that our Minister of Health is trying to become a monarch.
Well, excuse me. Thank you again for having me. It's good to be invited back. Actually, twice now. Actually. So, yeah. Look, this doesn't keep me up at night. Selfishly, I'm not a smoker. If it were a bill or an act on alcohol, I might have a different view. Don't try and police how much wine I'm drinking in Stellenbosch. I don't want to see a Stellenbosch municipal law enforcement officer come and measure how much wine I'm consuming on a Saturday afternoon in Franschhoek. But that, if that were the case, then I might care. But joking aside, it goes along with this sort of edifice of legislation. And it's almost the ANC's modus operandi at this point. Well, it has been for some time. You don't have control of the military, or you don't have control of the police, at least an effective police or military. So all you do is legislate. Legislation about this, legislation about that. Quite similar. R.W. Johnson made the point about the Nats in the 1980s. This edifice of legislation is just built up. What color a person can hold a ladder, what color a person can put on the paint, and so on. And who's policing all of this? Who's going to come around and say, are you smoking in that area? Is that forbidden area? Is that area long enough? Is that area wide enough? And so on. That strikes me as an enormous waste of state resources and time and energy. But you can see the point if South Africa were a country like Sweden, and you mentioned Sweden, a lot of sort of Northern Europe, Northern Central Europe, to an extent in the UK as well, that if the majority of healthcare provision is a national provider and is nationally funded through tax revenues and is efficient and working, kind of like, as I say, a lot of Northern Central Europe, Western Europe, then there is a good argument for high taxation on things like smoking and alcohol, in my view, because abuse of those things will cost taxpayer, and that's sort of the way societies in Central and Western Europe operate. I would get behind that to a large extent, but obviously in the South African context, that's not really what's going to happen. In the South African context, an edifice of legislation on one thing will only create, as somebody made the point a few minutes ago, entities trying to subvert that and trying to go about that the other way. Lots of edifice of legislation on mining equals illegal mining or no mining. Lots of edifice of legislation on tobacco will mean illegal smoking and illegal rights to pursue that and to distribute it and to retail it and so on. So, yeah, those are a few points I could make about that. Until the ANC comes after me about beer or wine consumption, it's not going to keep me up at night. But those are some sort of points that I can offer. But a last point I'll say related to this, and two of you guys made the point already. It's about the role of business in South Africa. I made this point on a podcast yesterday as well. Business has a huge role to play in South Africa. And, from a structural standpoint, it's a good thing that South Africa has a diverse economy and lots of diverse types of businesses and sort of distribute centers of power and so on. It means that it's harder it's harder for the society to fail if you have economic diversity. It's a bulwark against sort of external shocks if you were too reliant on one commodity or whatever, or one sector. In the case of Zimbabwe, agriculture, or whatever the case may be. But so it's a good thing that there are businesses and there are vested interests in South Africa. I think it's one of the one of the factors in favor of its long-term success. But it's problematic if business is getting into bed with government on these types of legislation, and in some cases, perhaps some may say cozying up to it and even writing it and actively supporting it, because if there's 200 labor laws and however many other laws on any given sector, well, then that's very hard for smaller businesses to compete, isn't it? And you don't have a team of lawyers to comply with 200 labor laws or export laws or localization laws or whatever the case may be. That probably to a large extent explains market concentration of big companies in South Africa, why there's almost like cartel sort of driven. I'm not sure the details exactly, but I know Herman Pretorius at the IRR did a good tweet on it not so long ago. Five or so businesses in telecoms, 5 or so businesses in this sector, 5 or so businesses in that sector. That's not good for long-term health of the economy. So yeah, there's some points I can offer.
So, Sean, you've done something very bad here, because you've created the perfect step-off point to our next topic, but I still have things to say about the current topic. So we hold that, because I know Ayanda especially want to talk about, in relation to the next topic, which is about the DA's bill to oppose BEE, and talking about big businesses' role in regulations, and also using their positions to basically keep out smaller players. So we just hold that thought, because I just want to go back to your earlier point, which is I want to talk about like the problem of essentially planning health, because you said how you think there's more of a point, more of a justification for regulating people's health if it's taxpayer-funded national healthcare system. And like, maybe I can see that if I'm going to put a utilitarian hat on, but I don't have a utilitarian hat. So I think just the big thing is that why I'm addicted to slippery slopes, and this is why I don't smoke. But I feel that if they can go after the smokers, they're going to go after the drinkers. We already know the EFF is trying to go after the drinkers. So I know that you care deeply about this. And then after they're done with the drinkers, they're going to go after people who like sugar. They're going to go after people who like fatty foods. They're going to go after the people who sit around too much. Or they're going to go after the people who exercise too much, because some people have heart attacks when they run too much. I think that's just the big problem with trying to police people's health is complicated. Everyone's different. We have people like Winston Churchill, who smoked copious amounts of cigars every day, drank himself silly, ate huge amounts of unhealthy food, yet he lived to a very ripe old age. Then we have other people like my grandfather, who only lived into his late 60s, and he was incredibly healthy because he just lost the genetic lottery and got cancer. And I think that's just the big issue, is that there's too many factors. My father smokes, and it's very bitter that he doesn't have high blood pressure. I do. He doesn't. I don't think he gets stressed. But he smokes, yet all of his physicals, he outperforms them. He's probably healthier than me. And this is why it's just so complicated, and this is why I think that why a national healthcare system is just such a hard thing to do. It's one of those things we are inevitably going to just have to absorb costs, because it's just so hard to try to police and try to regulate what actually goes into raising those costs. I think you can get millions of actuaries to try to price everything, and there's still going to be blind spots. Now, before I move on to the next topic, I've said a lot. So, do you want to respond, or does anyone else want to say something? Okay, Ayanda?
I want to add something, Nicholas, something very important here. I think in response to what Sean said, there's a big difference between criminalizing something that at a later point can impose a burden on others, as he said, and criminalizing something that violates people's rights. Right. So if I rely on public healthcare and I'm smoking and I'm killing myself, yes, I'm going to rely on the same healthcare system later on, which is funded by taxpayers. But in the very act of smoking, I'm not violating anyone's rights. I'm not violating anyone's freedoms, you know. And that kind of thinking for me is a bit problematic, because what it does is it makes us use the resources of the criminal justice system to focus on crimes that aren't even important. These things aren't even crimes. What you're actually criminalizing is peaceful and voluntary conduct. And you're diverting resources that should be there to fight violent crime in society. As an example, you're arresting people for carrying small bags of marijuana or whatever it may be. Those are petty, trivial things. You're supposed to be using those resources to actually go after people who are committing real crimes in society. So I guess the point I'm making is we must make a distinction between something which imposes a burden and something which violates someone else's rights. Because if you're going to make that argument, then I could easily say that old age is a burden as well. I mean, if someone is old and they're sickly, they need to be taken care of because they're ill and they're sick. But the idea of banning old age is absurd, because you know that the responsibility of taking care of old people lies with us as people and not the state. So we must draw this distinction between stuff which imposes a burden and stuff which actually violates other people's rights. Smoking in and of itself doesn't violate anyone else's rights. I think that's the point I wanted to add.
I think that you're opening up I can see a lot of people are, in early 20th century probably were thinking the same thing about old people being a burden. I'm glad that in general, though, we haven't really followed in their footsteps. But Sean, do you want to respond?
No, I don't really have a whole lot more to add now. I think I've said most of those things, I guess. Yeah, to sort of refine the point about Northern Western European sort of societies. I mean, it's a bit different because I guess in a lot of these cases, private healthcare isn't as prevalent, and the vast majority of people, if I'm not mistaken, in a lot of these countries and societies are using the state-run, state-funded healthcare system. And I think to a great extent, it is justified to tax something slightly heavier that may be then causing a burden later on in the system. You can still have the right to do it and to exercise it. You're not doing anyone else any harm at that particular moment in a public, so long as it's outside or whatever the case may be. But that's, I guess, as far as I would take that. But yes, there does come a point where you overtax things, and the natural sort of widespread response is negative because people try and avoid it altogether. So yeah, that's all I have to say on that, really.
Yeah, I think the main thing is the Laffer curve, where basically, so we can say, because I think that as much, I'm anti-tax or whatever. If I'm going to do a compromised position and you're going to have a national healthcare system, funding it with sin tax, not the worst thing in the world. But the problem in South Africa is the sin tax on cigarettes and alcohol is just far too high. And it has pushed, as Joe mentioned earlier, it has pushed people into buying the cheaper alternatives. Because most of a buck... So, yeah?
different policies in the context of different countries will work and will play out in certain ways, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's the main thing as well, is that while there are general principles that can apply to most societies, everything needs to be taken in its context. And that's especially important actually for this topic. And I think that'll be the closing thing. Unless, Joe, you have something you want to say about tobacco? Cool. Is that this is a policy that has been pushed on South Africa by international organizations, by the World Health Organization, by US anti-tobacco lobbies. It does not reflect the will of the people in South Africa. And I think that's my closing statement for this topic, is that this is not a South African law. This is a foreign law that the ANC has made part of its fanatical ideology of wanting to control people. And I think they probably like using it as a test case, as I said earlier, to create a precedent where they can effectively just rule by decree. Now, let's go on to another topic, which I know we've all been excited about, which is probably the ANC's main policy, which is now under threat. So earlier this week, the Democratic Alliance, which is supposed to be the junior partner in the Government of National Unity, but I would still say functionally is the opposition party, it has announced that it will be proposing gazetting a bill to replace Black economic empowerment with a non-racial affirmative action policy that is needs-based. So rather than using race as a substitute for disadvantage, it will be looking at genuine disadvantage, genuine levels of poverty, and genuine need in order to provide for job quotas or for managerial positions. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I tried to find it, but I couldn't find if they've actually formally written the proposal yet and what form it will take, because I think that will be very important, what mechanism it takes, because I'm always hesitant when it comes to anything that interferes in how businesses do their work. But as a compromise, anything that takes the ability for these elites from the ANC to just seize government positions and to force themselves in there with tenders is good in my books. Ayanda, and especially you can leap straight onto as well, if you want to, the thing earlier about how big business is, its role in BEE in general, if you would like.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicholas. I've been dying to speak about this topic. We spoke about this earlier on, before we entered the show. So I think, as I said earlier on, I don't want to focus on the politics of the GNU and the internal dynamics. I want to focus on the bill itself and its provisions, because I do understand that many people are angry at the DA. They are dissatisfied, and they're rightly angry, because there is a sense that the party hasn't done enough to push back against the ANC in terms of all these harmful economic policies that it has implemented in the last year or so. But as I said, I want to focus on the bill itself, because I have went through the bill and some of its key provisions. So essentially, I think we should welcome this bill, which the DA is tabling as an alternative to BEE. It has, I would argue, two major strengths and maybe one, not a weakness, but an area where it can be improved. The first major strength, as you've noted, Nicholas, is that you're removing race as a proxy for disadvantage. And you're going to assist people on the basis of socioeconomic disadvantage. And what that immediately does is it closes the tap of elite enrichment, because what we have in South Africa is a concerning trend where you have the small group of people in society who are empowered, who have already benefited from these laws. But because BEE moves from the notion of equal disadvantage, this idea that all of us as Black people are still equally disadvantaged, those people who have already been empowered are still being empowered. So someone who lives in Sandton, who is part of the Black elite, is in the same position as someone who lives in a township and is poor. And that's what you're trying to avoid by removing race as a proxy for disadvantage. You're saying, let us assist people who are in genuine need of empowerment and not elites like Ramaphosa and his brother-in-law who owns that club called Sundowns. So that is a major win, I would argue. But the second point is a more substantive one, because what the DA is saying is we must essentially repeal preferential procurement specifically, which has been the key lever that the ANC has used to enforce BEE in the private sector. And what preferential procurement basically means is that if you want to do business with the state, if you want to be awarded tenders and contracts, you need to be compliant with BEE through its scorecard system that has 5 pillars, which we all know. That is what it says. And now, that is a problem because the ANC's approach has been to prioritize BEE compliance over efficiency, over cost effectiveness, and over quality. That means, Nicholas, if you and I want to win a tender from the state and my company is more compliant than yours in terms of BEE, even if you as a supplier can supply at a lower cost with better quality, the government will pick me and be willing to pay double the price it pays to you because of BEE premiums, because it prioritizes, it rewards BEE compliance over efficiency. That is a big problem, and there are 3 major issues that come with that. Number one, because of BEE premiums, you have suppliers who inflate the price when they procure goods on behalf of government. You hear cases of a company that procures maybe 100 laptops for government and it charges something like 20 million rand. And you wonder why. And it is because of BEE premiums. It's because the government is willing to pay more money if you're compliant with BEE. The other issue that comes with that is fronting in the private sector, as I mentioned earlier on, where there are companies that deliberately ramp up their BEE scores. Deliberately, they push black people into ownership positions, into management posts, just so they have high BEE scores and they can qualify for tenders and state contracts. The problem with fronting is, even if you're giving these black individuals ownership stakes and you parachute them into management, they don't have any real power in the organization. It's just mere window dressing. But you're doing that because you want to qualify for contracts and state tenders. The third issue associated with that, closely tied to preferential procurement, is gatekeeping. Because if you run a small, efficient business that can procure goods at a cheaper price at higher quality, but you aren't BEE compliant, you are effectively locked out. And those contracts only go to those who are compliant with BEE. So the DA's proposal is good because they want to change the entire BEE scorecard system. And their scorecard system has 3 main points. It's value for money, if I'm not wrong. It's the disqualification criteria, and it is economic inclusion. And I argue that this is a better approach because how does it work? When you no longer use preferential procurement to enforce BEE, what you're going to eliminate, number one, is the issue of BEE premiums. Once you eliminate the issue of BEE premiums, you're going to save more taxpayer money, because when the government wants to procure something, it's not going to spend double or triple more than the money it should spend. It is going to expend less amount of money and it will procure those goods at a cheaper price and for a better quality. The second thing is you're going to reduce the fronting, because right now, the way in which the system works in rewarding compliance, it creates incentives for window dressing and this fronting that we've seen. But the third major point that I want to make is that the scorecard system being proposed by the DA, I would argue, Nicholas, and I know you and I may differ on this, it promotes genuine economic inclusion. Why? Because if you look at the BEE scorecard system itself, ownership, management control, enterprise and supplier development, skills development, socioeconomic development, if you look at these 2 pillars, ownership and management control, they concentrate the benefits of BEE in this elite, because the people who are getting equity in some of these big companies are politicians. They are people who are in the ANC's patronage network. The people being parachuted in companies into management, who are sitting on boards of Discovery and this and that company, these are politicians, these are elites. So if you remove that scorecard system and you say those businesses which will qualify for contracts are those that actually invest in certain communities, they create jobs, and they invest through social programs, I would argue you widen the benefits of BEE, as opposed to one where you have a few politicians making deals with people in the private sector and becoming fabulously wealthy. So I think that scorecard system being proposed is much better than what we have right now. So my last point, which has to do with what I think is a major weakness and where there can be an improvement, BEE has essentially evolved in 3 waves since 1994. We are now in the 3rd wave of BEE, which began around 2018. The dangerous thing about the 3rd wave of BEE is that it isn't only limited to doing business with the state. So that is to say, BEE is no longer being enforced by the state in South Africa. It's also being enforced through regulations now. You can't actually operate in certain sectors of the economy if you aren't compliant with BEE. We saw this now with Sokalige, with the case they fought over aviation licenses. So BEE is now determining who has access to the economy. That is dangerous and intrusive. The other thing is that now BEE is also being enforced by certain actors in the private sector, through private sector supply chains, where you have a bigger company that you work with as a smaller company saying, we won't work with you if you aren't compliant with BEE. And my fear is that the bill we are seeing now with the DA does not address that. It doesn't address the question of a minister can wake up tomorrow morning and say, for example, in the tech sector, if your tech company isn't BEE compliant, you won't get a license, you can't operate. It doesn't deal with that. And the other thing is, it doesn't deal with bigger players in the private sector who are forcing smaller players to comply with BEE. And this brings me to my last point. I made this to you earlier on, Nicholas, that we have bigger players in the private sector who are in bed with the government. It is not all of them, but some of them are in bed with the government. And these are the same businesses that in the first wave of BEE in the early 90s, they had these arrangements, they had these negotiations with certain leaders in the political elite to give them shares and to give them ownership stakes in their companies and to reinforce the status quo that we see in South Africa. So really at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is to close the tap on procurement, which is a key lever that has been used to enforce BEE, but you're also trying to avoid a situation where a minister can wake up tomorrow morning and say, you cannot operate in the sector. You won't get a license if you aren't compliant with BEE. And my hope is that Sokalige wins this case it is fighting internationally. They have won domestically, but they must win internationally. It cannot be that we are going to gatekeep in the economy and say companies that aren't compliant with BEE cannot be allowed to operate. That is something dangerous, and it will discourage many companies from investing in the country.
Thank you. I do agree with you, Ayanda, but almost everything. I think my entire thing was just a little bit of I'm always tentative of government interference in anything. So that's why I'm just a little bit. That's why I'm glad you mentioned the scorecard, because you know the specifics more than me. But I'm also always a little bit scared that. So this is pulling back from the worst thing. So if BEE is the worst possible policy for this, and there are worse afterwards, but I'm just saying, let's say this is the level that we're at. This goes back to less bad, and it's honestly, it's mostly good. It actually is a good system. I'm worried about how future governments will determine economic inclusion, how they will determine community investment, because you let the government touch anything, and they'll find a way to turn it into corruption. I think my last point before I move to you, Joe, is that also to go on to that we actually have a real life example of how ending BEE procurement benefits something. The Eskom used to be shackled by BEE procurement. If it wants to replace any parts, if it wants to repair anything, it had to go through the BEE tendering process, and then nothing was getting done, and it was costing exorbitant amounts of money. There was something where they spent like tens of thousands of rands to replace a mop. But there was one simple thing they did when they replaced Derator and the new guy came in. They unshackled him. They told him, you don't have to go through BEE procurement. You can purchase straight from the manufacturer. And that solved so much. Now, it didn't solve everything. Our declining economy solved most of that. So there's not as much electricity demand. But it did solve a hang of a lot. They can actually start repairing the power plants now because they don't have to go through a tendering process. But Joe.
Yeah. So again, agree with a lot of what Ayanda said. But I don't know, man. Like, okay, so there's two things here. One is that I don't think this bill is going to go far because one, the people who created the bill didn't consult any of the GNU parties, and apparently some of the GNU parties are not very happy that they weren't consulted, especially the likes of the ANC and other political parties. So when when it gets tabled, when they vote on it and all that stuff, when it goes through the process, it's dead in the water, in my opinion. There's going to be a lot of sharks trying to attack it, and like, you know, I think this is gonna. I think the DA was trying to have like a one up on the elections, like, hey, look at us guys, we're attacking BE, blah blah. And then when it comes down to it, when the time comes for actually implementing or putting this through Parliament and all that stuff, they're gonna have egg on their faces. That's my prediction. I hope I'm wrong, but I highly doubt that a lot of the lefty politicians out there are going to agree with this bill and completely get rid of, or not completely, but get rid of BE on some levels, because it's also a patronage network that relies on these policies, right? So you're not gonna have those that are making a lot of money off of BE suddenly go like, you know what, guys, DA, shit. What were we thinking? Of course, thank you for this bill. We never thought that creating a bill like this would solve the problem. It's just not going to happen. And maybe I'm a bit negative about it, but I do think the DA are just posturing at this point. And then there was something else that I wanted to mention about like my opinion on BE in general. I do agree that the wrongs of the past need to be addressed. 100% for that. Have no issue with that. Agreed. But I think it is the ANC's sweetest and most ironic thing about their existence is that had they focused on creating a very successful, growing economy that didn't focus and wasn't race-based, or wasn't so fixated on race, but just fixated on growing an environment that encourages investment, encourages growth, encourages trade, I think we would have seen a very, very different South Africa. And there's a little bit of proof that South Africa was on that way. If you look back in history and you look at between 1994 and 1998, there was a brief moment in history where GDP was great, unemployment was low, everything was looking great until the Zuma era started and state capture and all that stuff. So there was, because they like to say, yeah, but it's the legacy of apartheid. No. There was a time when South Africa had the potential to grow into one of the most powerful economies in Africa, and it could have been even bigger now. And ANC just got greedy, and they went from a liberation party to a corrupt cronyism and all that stuff kind of political party, and wanted to rob South Africa blind because they feel that they are the chiefs now and they deserve the spoils, not the people. And that's exactly what's happened. So in my opinion, BE should be completely scrapped. There needs to be, in every shape or form, no matter where it is, scrap it completely. Let's get it completely out of the way and look at real, tangible solutions to uplift the people. And one of them being a free market. Markets will, yes, there's going to be a bit of uncertainty in the markets for a little bit until it stabilizes and growth actually happens. Because imagine a world where big businesses want to invest in South Africa, want to make a home here and give jobs, because that's where jobs come from, right? If a new company like Starlink wants to come here and have a factory here or whatever, or just a headquarters, that means jobs. They need people. They need people in those buildings. That's job opportunity right there. And it continues to grow as businesses come back. There's been a lot of businesses that have left South Africa. A lot of big companies have left South Africa, leaving a gaping hole and adding to the unemployment rate in South Africa. So imagine those businesses came back. And a lot of it is to blame on BEE. Not entirely. There's other policies that are harmful, like the Equity Act, or what's it called, the one that the quota about races and stuff like that, and other policies, red tape. But I think that if I'm really against BE, so that's my take on that. Like, just scrap it completely. Let's build this country the way it was supposed to be built, with opportunity for everyone, and truly uplift not just the poor, the middle class, everyone. Let's have a bigger middle class. Let's create that wealth that exists in South Africa, and it can be achieved. And I think South Africa can still be saved, but we need a complete overhaul.
Well, Joe, you've got my vote very firmly. Speaking my language, I want to say I'm quoting men at work and say you're speaking my language, but apparently it's asking, do you speak my language? That's a missed joke there. There's something I want to just go back to what you're saying about the DA. How there's a kind of posturing, and I agree with you. I think it is posturing, but I don't necessarily think that's a problem. I think that I think they're starting to realize they're an opposition party that's been kind of duped into getting a little bit of some cabinet positions, and they've been doing relatively well at the cabinet positions they have. I can't fault them at that, but it's not the crucial thing. They need to get control of the DIRCO, they need control of trade and industry, they need control of the police in order to actually get things done, and that means they need to win more votes in the upcoming elections, not just the metro one, but the national ones after that. And I think that if they can change the narrative on BEE, which I believe is the foundational original sin of the new South Africa, I believe that it is even while we had a positive growth under Mbeki, especially under Trevor Manuel, and especially under when there was Gear, I do still think that all of that was temporary because BE was setting that rot, was starting that rot. And the thing is that it was going to happen regardless, even if Zuma didn't happen, because BE is that destructive. It's something that just allows these corrupt elites who don't know what they're doing to just get in there and just start looting. And I think that it should be more of a question of, rather than should the DA not risk getting egg on their face, rather that they need to figure out how can they ensure that they won't get egg on their face. And before I move on to you, Sean, my final point with this is I think that they should be not focusing on the non-racial aspect of it, because I don't think that resonates with South Africans as much as it should. I think that they should be focusing on the fact that this pulls away benefiting the already rich elites and rather focuses on benefiting the truly deserving poor. I think that should be the main focus. Sean.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I have a few things to say on this one. So if you listen to Anthea Jeffrey at Race Relations, she's written quite extensively about this, right? And her point is that it was never really a benign policy. It was always part of a long-term cunning plan to slowly choke private sector. And I think that's right, with the fig leaf of racial injustice in it. In some ways, it makes it quite a hard policy to criticize, especially as a white person, and especially, I guess, as an outsider. But it because it has that sort of front of previously disadvantaged majority of the population, it gives it makes it that little bit harder for somebody like me to criticize, but there we are. But look, I think there was a day when the DA was in favor of this kind of thing, if I'm not mistaken, back in 2019 or so, roughly. And if that were still the case today, then you would have a problem. I'm not sure how I'm not sure how rigorously in favor of the policy that in favor of BEE that the DI was. I wasn't really following South Africa back then, but my understanding is that they weren't truly committed or sold on the idea of non-racialism. And structurally that would be a problem now if DA was not opposing these policies. So you could see what was it Monday or Tuesday? It was Monday, wasn't it? You could see Monday as the day there was a crack in BEE, and the day that just see it as a little crack and something that slowly comes tumbling down. It's not going to come tumbling down overnight, but you have to be pragmatic about how you attack it. And saying, let's just completely liberalize the economy, let's just create a libertarian paradise. may work to some extent, but I think there's an element about South African society that it's so structurally unequal that there has to be something within the system deliberately designed to try and uplift people. Now, I'm not saying that should be racial. I think it should be non-racial, but by virtue of South African demographics, the vast majority of such a policy, are going to be black, because the black population is the majority of the population. So, I think this is very much a positive step. I think the dial has moved in terms of conversations around BEE, and certainly things like The Economist, maybe a number of months ago, did quite a bit of extensive column on it. The FT last week as well. And they've cited the William Gumede at Wits, who has said that 100 people have been funneled 1 trillion rand, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? That's absolutely astronomical. By the way, if you repeat that slogan over and over again, that'll win the 2029 election, and that'll crack and that'll crumble BEE. It's slogans like that win elections. That's the South African election of the Brexit bust. And if any of you follow British politics, that the UK wasted £350 million a week on European Union membership. That was a completely non-starter, by the way, but the comparison is the same, that it's a number which resonates and lands with people, and if you repeat that, that'll win. I'm pretty confident stuff like that will win the 2029 election, and South Africa may just be successful and may just reach a land of post-liberation normalization of the economy. So, yeah, I mean, those are kind of a lot of thoughts I have on the DA's recent policy announcement. I think the procurement sort of points that they offer, I think that's good, and a small percentage of it, if I'm not mistaken, was dedicated or appointed to sort of contribution and exports and jobs and so on. I think that those are positive steps. I wonder if the DA is testing the water slightly. They started off a few months ago with explicitly stating that they were against BEE. Fast forward a couple of months, and now they've tabled a bill on procurement and on a differential system of procurement. Fast forward a couple of months, you never know. They may just say my word, education vouchers, but we'll not get into that. But anyway, yeah, and I think even if it isn't implemented in its entirety, which, let's face it, it probably won't be. It still goes to the point that the DA is effectively the opposition with 6 cabinet seats. So they're seen to be fighting. They're seen to be in there. They're seen to be proposing things in the face of an obstructionist ANC that's standing in the way of liberalising and normalising the economy. In doing that, they avoid the trap, global trend in coalitions of the junior partner being completely swallowed up and gobbled up at the next election, and may just grow at the next election, and may just have a more balanced political environment come 2029. Yeah.
Very good points there, Sean. I know, Joe, you had something in response?
Yeah, more of just to add to Sean's point about the DA and their supporting of the BE. So what's interesting and something I've always found very faulted them about is you have John Steenhuisen, the leader of the DA. And then you have John Steenhuisen, the Minister of Agriculture. Okay. And what he tries to do is he tries to wear the one hat and then he tries to wear the other hat as if they're completely separate. So if he's got his agriculture hat on as the Minister of Agriculture, you mustn't see him as the DA leader. He is the Minister of Agriculture. Okay. But if he's wearing his DA attire, then he is the leader of the DA. And you saw this very interestingly. It was a few months back when they did this agriculture seminar thing, and he was directly asked about EWC, and or Dean McPherson actually said, EWC is a good thing. We're going to be able to use it, blah, 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 blah. And then you had John. There was such an uproar about it on social media that John had to quickly get into his DA outfit and say the DA is completely against the EWC. We are fighting it in court, blah, 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 blah. And you had kind of the same kind of stance with BE, because when it was also around that time, John Hector, and he was in Parliament saying that we will use BE to better enhance agriculture and give. There's far less black people in the agriculture sector, so we want to use BE to get more black people in, and then now the DA stance is no, we're completely against BE, blah blah. And this is what irritates people about the DA. It feels like you're flip-flopping. It feels like you're not making a stance. It feels like you're just going with what you think the voters want and stuff like that. And stop doing that. Stop. Just stick to your principles and your manifesto and be bold about it. Just say it how it is and stick with it. But the DA, I understand people are going to tell me they're in a very delicate situation because they're part of the GNU and they gotta act along to get along and blah blah blah. No, just you're either an opposition party or you're not, and just exist the way you're supposed to exist, because you're confusing the voters. And I think they say that their voters are increasing. Maybe they've gotten a lot more of the black vote. I don't know. But to me, in the circles I go around and my comment section on my social media across the board, not just on YouTube, there's a lot of people that are very upset with the DA. So I don't know. The municipal elections are going to be very interesting, and so is next year so is the next elections in 2029. I don't know how that's going to go. I don't know how this is going to pan out. But yeah, the point I'm trying to make here is that Sean made a good point of bringing up like this weird back and forth with BE and the DA. So I just wanted to make this point.
Can I add one thing on Dean McPherson's comments, which, by the way, were not very constructive or helpful? I think the idea of property rights, and by the way, that bill, that EWC bill was nothing really to do with land, or it's about general property. We don't have to get too much into the detail, but what Dean McPherson said was very problematic for the DA. If he said that, or if a DA minister said that a week or 2 weeks or 1 month before an election, that would be seriously problematic. That could have tanked the DA's number by a number of percentage points that wouldn't otherwise have done. So, the problem with Marxist policies like that is that you can't reverse your way back out of them. Once you take over land, once you confiscate land, it's very, very difficult to regain that trust. And look at the case of Zimbabwe. 20 coming up to 30 years later, what was the breadbasket of Africa is now not doing very well. Let's put it that way. But certain I'm going to say like certain capitalist policies that maybe haven't worked well, or something that's being done in an incorrect way. You might talk some sort of attempts at privatization in Britain. You can always try and rebalance that, because the structure of your country and the integrity of your country is still there. But once you undermine property rights, that's a very difficult, if not impossible, thing to go back on. It completely undermines the fabric of a society. That's why far leftist policies such as hyperinflation and EWC are so damaging and detrimental and hostile. So, yeah, I guess getting back to what Joe said, I don't really know what or why Dean McPherson said that. I tried to work that out in my head at the time. And was that, I think he said it at an agricultural conference in the Free State, did he? Is that big agri-business sort of muscle memory of go along to get along with the ANC? And was the DA guilty of that on a portfolio which it has on one of the most detrimental policies you could ever implement? This is serious stuff. And then Helen Zille saving the day 1 week later with a short video of filing the papers at the Western Cape High Court to fight the bill. And if I'm not mistaken, that's not the only legal challenge against that act. So one hopes for the fabric of South African society that that bill is repealed, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with the historical injustices of the past. It's to do with state power. Let's be honest about it.
I think a big problem with the DA, and sorry, and I know you want us to focus on the substance of the bill, but the DA always and its inadequacies always come up. I think that to go with John Steenhuisen changing his hats, I think the problem with a lot of DA officials, and this is one of the virtues as well, sadly, is that they fundamentally do believe in almost like a separation of church and state. If the DA is the church, then their position in government's the state, and they believe that in doing the job. And this makes them good at running municipalities. It makes them good at running ministries, but it makes them really bad at electoral politics. And I think that there's the game. The ANC and the DA are playing fundamentally different games. The DA is trying to play a game of governance, trying to play a game of service delivery, and the ANC is playing a game of ideology. And the problem is that the ANC has set the game, and the DA is trying to play a different game on the sidelines. That's not how it works. The DA has to play the ANC's game, but it's refusing to do so. And when it tries to do so, it's quite bad. To go back earlier to what you're saying, Sean, the DA kind of nominally did support BE for a while because the DA was so obsessed with trying to appeal to the broad voters in South Africa that they appointed leaders and officials who were basically a disgruntled ANC officials. And that's the problem. They were disgruntled because of corruption and other things, but they still fundamentally believed in the vision, the ANC's vision. But that's not the DA's vision. And Joe, you're completely right. The DA needs to be bold. I think voters would respect that. They need to, and I think that they mix up the substance of policy with their presentation. You can present almost any policy in a way which will appeal to almost any voter. But unless that voter is like very, very fanatical, pushed in some ideological way. But for the generalized voter, who isn't a Marxist, who isn't a nationalist, who isn't a libertarian, who isn't any of these labels, they will have very practical, pragmatic views on certain political issues. That's why I think it's very important what you were talking about, Sean, is that we focus this marketing of this anti-BEE on showing how it's hurting South Africans, how it's enriching elites, how it's costing people money. I think we see the number of the 3 trillion, I think you said, and we can say that it's some numbers from the Free Market Foundation's report that BEE is costing the economy 290 billion rand a year in wasted expenditure. It's costing 5 trillion rand since its inception. 2.4%. Without it, we could have had a growth of 2.4% of our GDP per annum and could have created 4 million jobs. That's 4 million people who could be feeding their families, who could be paying tax, who could just be living a better life. Those are the numbers, and I agree with you completely. And I hope the DA does this because I don't think focusing on the non-racial aspect works anymore. I think that the ANC's captured the racial, non-racial narrative, that they own that narrative. So there's no point playing it. So I agree with you completely. You going to basics, to people's wallets, to people's livelihoods, to their children's futures. That's the way to win the upcoming elections.
Yeah, I think someone said the DA should be South Africa's chief operating officers. Potholes, finances, administration, bureaucracy. And I think there's truth in that. And that's why the DA councils are South Africa's best governed councils. That's not a political statement. That's objectively true from data. And you're lacking a CEO to point the finger and say, let's go for 7% growth. Let's refit the train lines. Let's refit the coal fleet. Let's scrap BEE, replace it with some sort of means-tested poverty system, uplift everybody. Let's, think of policies that are friendly to fixed investment, which leads to growth, which leads to jobs. And there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's. Sorry. Yeah.
No.
Ayanda. Sorry. Yeah. I think let's end off on what you want to talk about, the substance of the bill, because I think we've in every podcast we tend to start complaining about the DA or talk about what they can do better. So you get to set the ending tone of this debate on the new proposed anti-BE proposal.
Yeah, great stuff. I think Joe is opening a can of worms here, and there's a reason why I didn't want to talk about the politics, because we can go on about it the whole day. I mean, I have my own issues with the DA as well. I mean, from Jordan Hill Lewis in the Western Cape to what's happening now with Helen Zille in Johannesburg, because part of the problem is with them, they want to argue that ideology isn't relevant in the sphere of local governance, so they can push through policies that aren't compatible with their values. That's a big problem. Ideology is relevant in local government. It is. I mean, things like cross-subsidizing. You have governments that are investing far more in social programs, and they aren't saving ratepayers' money that can be invested into the economy in creating businesses. So that's a very dangerous thing. I think Helen and they mustn't say that ideology is irrelevant in the sphere of local governance. Jordan Hill Lewis in Cape Town is up to mischief, but I won't go into what he's doing there. But to reframe this discussion again and to make two last points to you, Sean. The problem with state intervention in South Africa is it has done more harm than good. And I often say this to people. Take it down to the level of someone who's living again in a township and you want to start a business, right? If you want to see what free enterprise can do, Sean, look at how immigrants in South Africa are prospering. Look at the guys who are selling in tuck shops, for instance, right? They don't comply with regulations, many of them. They don't pay taxes. And look at how much income they're managing to generate. And contrast that to a South African who wants to start a small business, right? You have no money, Sean. You have no much capital. You want to start a food business, for example. You have the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which says you need to have 2 sinks to operate, 2 separate sinks. Now, where do you find money to buy sinks before you even open a business, Sean? Where do you find the money? And my point is that those regulations drive up the cost of business and they end up excluding small businesses from the economy. Big businesses
I agree, yeah.
have the resources to absorb the costs. I'm not saying that like those policies are good, but big businesses can handle them. If you're a big business, you can comply with the minimum wage. But if you're a small business operating in a township, where do you get the money to comply with those costs? You don't.
Yeah,
I
agree. I said that. I said exactly that at the beginning of the.
End up being shut out. So what you don't want to do is to push out the businesses which need to be in there. Which brings me to my last point. Freedom is not something which you obtain overnight. You get it in installments. Just as the government fights freedom in installments, you get freedom in installments. So the DA's proposal isn't some silver bullet, but I'm saying it is much better than what you have in place now. So that's why I'm arguing, at least in terms of substance, that it is better. We're not going to have BEE premiums anymore. We won't have preferential procurement. What we're going to have now, well, I mean, depending on whether they can implement this, David in his column says they must just go and implement it, go ahead and implement it. Of course, they won't do that, of course. I mean, the DA has its own issues. But my point to you is we fight for freedom in installments. It's a step-by-step thing. We won't get there overnight. And so there will be contradictions along the way, there will be issues. But where the alternatives that challenge those that exist, I think we do need to engage with them in good faith, and we do need to engage with their merits and their weaknesses.
There's a lot of passionate agreement here. So with the, I think something at the end of the day, I think we all agree that BE is possibly the worst thing in the country. And I think that as much as I have misgivings, I think as much as a lot of us have our own problems with the DA, I think that we all, at least a little bit, agree that any move away from the BE, and I think that raise your hand if you did not feel at least a little bit of joy with the DA making this proposal on Monday. So yeah, so I think we're all on the same page here. Best thing to do: require people to do action in the opposite way.
That says a lot. Just by the way, that's a lot.
Yeah. And I think that we're past the hour now. So, Joe, do you have any closing statements? Because I think the rest of us, we've had our closing statements.
Sure. So I'm going to keep it light. So Ayanda, I follow you. I've seen your work on Free Market Foundation. I really enjoy the content that you put out. I agree with a lot of what you say. So thank you for doing your work and contributing, as well as you, Nicholas. Your report on the tobacco bill was phenomenal. I did a video on it. I thought it was great. Sean, it's the first time I'm meeting you, but I definitely hope to get more of your content and get to know more about you. I enjoy your feedback as well, and I think you brought up some great points as well. So, well, with Ayanda's point about the townships, I think is also very important. Like, there is this separate economy almost that exists within these little enclaves, if you will. It's rough in those areas, obviously. There's definitely, people are poor and living in horrible conditions. But it's amazing what has been done in that community to survive. They've made their own economy. And I think there's some interesting things. I encourage people to go look at a little township in Mussel Bay, where a man, I think it's Bitcoin Africa, I'm not sure, I could be wrong about the name, Zanzi Bitcoin or something like that, where this guy has basically started to get Bitcoin into the township, and they're using it, and they're trading with it, and it's really amazing, and it's helping them because they're finding it better than money, and more valuable than money. And again, another thing about like how if you leave people, or in this case, they were put in a position where they needed to survive, that people will resort to old historical habits of trade and growth and make their own rules to be able to prosper as much as possible. Now, obviously, if you're in a township, there is like a ceiling, and that's another discussion for another day. But my point is that humans are resilient. Humans are always capable of rising above. And I think if we can scrap this BE policy in its entirety, that's the goal, the end goal. And I agree with Sean that there needs to be checks and balances. We'll figure that out. But for the time being, like Ayanda just said, the current bill that's being tabled is much better than the previous bill, fine. But I think the end goal is to get to a point where, like Sean said, we have people that are poor. We need to address that. We have an economy that's being choked. We need to undo the chains and do away with BE. That's the end goal, and allow the economy to thrive so that every South African can put food on their table, provide for their family, and afford healthcare, afford a house, and be able to live very happily. And I'm telling you now, for the politicians that are listening, this is DAPA, whoever the hell listens, if they do listen to this, and maybe you guys should clip this part and make sure they hear it. If you guys would just focus on doing that, delivering that to the South African people, you'd win your vote. It's as simple as that. Campaign on that, promise that, deliver that. You will remain in power for eternity. That's what people want. That's what people care about. A safe place to do business, provide for their family. Listen to the people for once.
Once again, you've got my vote, Joe. 100%. And you've literally, I'm going to figure out how to clip things so I can clip that. Now, final thing, because is everyone, I want you to say where people can follow you and how they can follow you. And then I'll do concluding remarks. Starting with you, Ayanda, how can people follow you?
Yeah, people can follow me on X at AS Zulu or Swakilega Mkhulunyelwa. That's a bit of a complicated thing. Yeah, but it's mainly on X. I have an X account there. And I'm a very, not controversial, but very outspoken guy. You know, I get attacked for my views, but follow me on X, man. Follow me on X. I'm out.
Sure. I think that most of our audience here is probably coming from your your network, but how can the rest follow you?
Yes, so I very easy newsflash with Joe Emilio, and you can find me on any of the platforms: Facebook, Instagram, X, TikTok, YouTube. Very easy to find. Just Google Joe Emilio or newsflash with Joe Emilio. Very easy to find. Thank you guys once again for having me. It's always great to be back and always interesting conversations. And I hope people learned something and we gave you something to think about.
And Sean, where can people follow you?
Thanks. Yeah. So first thing is Substack. So it's Rebooting Britain. So REBOOTING and Britain. And you can follow me for free with your email. And I always strive to be as robust and as independent as I can. I don't publish anything unless I believe it's got those minimum prerequisites. And please write in. And please, as people are starting to write in, my Substack, give me some ideas of businesses that are doing really cool things and innovating and creating new products and so on. Councils that have interesting projects, civil society groups and so on. So yeah, I'll always respond and engage with everybody. So Substack is the main place. Also, X, or I say Twitter because I'm a millennial. It's at Sean SM218, and yeah, you can find my stuff there as well. And yeah, thanks to you guys for the opportunity, and likewise, I hope people enjoyed the conversation and the engagement.
Thank you so much. I really liked the conversation. I think it was a very interesting topic. For me, I'm starting a Substack where I'm just going to be reposting all my chaotic articles in the media because they're in too many different places. So I want one central place where people can find them. And that's nwoodsmith.substack.com. If you're interested in my fiction, you can go to nicholaswoodsmith.com. I'm not on the website formerly known as Twitter, but you can follow the Rational Standard there, at Rational Stand. At Rational Stand was too long, so it's at Rational Stand. And this was all the way back in 2015, so you can see it was really must have been a lot of competition back then. Now, thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Rational Stand podcast. Please make sure to read the Free Market Foundation's latest report, which is by Gary Moore and Martin van Staden, and about ministerial overreach with the tobacco bill. You can find it at freemarketfoundation.com. The link should also be on the description on YouTube. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to rationalstandard.com for free so you can see all of our articles, including my article that was put out today. Thank you once again, and we'll see you next week.